The vote came up on the board before the chime finished sounding, and the number sat there, glowing long enough for everyone in the chamber to read it twice. 1,843 to 12. 12 lights burned silver. The board had never used that color before tonight, and Elder Valdris, in the highest row of the spire, thought that was almost funny, in the way things become funny after they've stopped being able to hurt you. 443 years old, and she still hadn't learned to expect anything different from this room. The petition from the 17 Rimwood worlds is denied, said Councillor T. Lack, not looking up from his data slate. The region is unregistered. The matter is closed. The petition is denied. The region stays unregistered. The matter is closed. 3 sentences, the same flat shape, and not one of them true in the way that mattered. Valdris looked down at her datapad, where a photograph sat behind the petition file, one she'd carried longer than most of the council had been alive. A human woman with gray-streaked hair, standing in front of a colony world gone quiet with dusk, holding a folded document. Small signatures ran along the bottom edge of it, more than she could count from a photograph taken 4 centuries ago. "We'll be here if you need us," the woman had said. Then humanity had gone quiet, and the galaxy, in its comfortable and enormous way, had decided that quiet meant gone. Beside her, young attaché Perrin, Valley, quick-eyed, still young enough at 100 years to think the council could be reasoned with, leaned over. "You could try again next cycle." "I have tried 9 cycles," Valdris said. 87 filings. "I'm not certain there is a next cycle left to try in." Perrin's ears folded back, the Valley gesture for something between worry and apology. He didn't have an answer for that, and she didn't expect one. At the podium, T. Lax set down his slate and looked out over the chamber, the way he always did after a vote, a man checking that the world had agreed with him, and finding, as always, that it had. 1,800 years he'd sat that chair. 1,800 years of never once needing to be wrong. "Counselor," Valdris said, rising. Her knees protested the movement the way they always did now, a small private complaint she'd stopped mentioning to anyone. "So is the fact that this sector has produced no verified contact of any kind in 400 years. No verified contact," Valdris said, "is not the same as no contact." Silence answered that. "The kind that isn't agreement and isn't disagreement. This is not the first warning I have filed on the Rim. It will not be the last." Tlake's gaze found her in the high row, patient in the particular way powerful people are patient with someone they've already decided doesn't matter. "Elder Valdris, your dedication is noted." Just a room waiting for her to sit back down so the session could move on to something that mattered to it. The 12 silver votes sat scattered near the back, the only councillors in the chamber who had ever, even once, stood in a room with a human. She stood there a moment longer than was comfortable, feeling 443 years of patience run thinner than it had ever run before, and then she said the thing she had come here today prepared to say and had hoped, right up until the vote lit up silver and red. She had spoken to each of them privately over the years. None of them had believed her either, not fully. Belief wasn't the problem. Filing a claim was easy. Making anyone red, it was not, that she would not need to. "Then I'm invoking the emergency witness protocol." The chamber's quiet changed shape. Not the bored quiet from before, the quiet of a room remembering a rule it had hoped never to need again. Somewhere below, a Councillor Valdris didn't knocked a stylus off a desk and didn't reach for it. T-Lake's mouth flattened into something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite fear, but stood close enough to both that she filed the expression away out of habit. "That measure hasn't been invoked in this council's living memory," he said. "I'm aware," Valdris said. "I looked it up this morning in case I needed it today. I had filed warnings like this for longer than the council cared to count. I never expected this to be the one that mattered. But something about the shape of today's silence told me it was." She left before the murmuring in the chamber had finished, out through the tall doors, down the pale stone corridors of the spire with their 9,000-year-old windows of blue haze. She did not look at the view the way tourists and new attachés always did. She had looked at it for 4 centuries. It had stopped being scenery and become simply the color of every hard conversation she'd ever had in this building. Perrin caught up to her at the second junction, breathing harder than the walk should have earned him. "Elder, the protocol. Do you understand what invoking it actually opens?" "Archive access," Valdris said. "Sealed vaults. Filing categories that predate half the current council. It also means, if you're wrong, they can strip your council seat for triggering it on a hunch. I'm aware of that too, she said, and did not slow down. Her quarters sat at the end of a corridor most attaches never had reason to walk. She kept an old habit here that made junior staff smile behind her back, a paper archive, physical files alongside the terminal everyone else trusted completely. She'd watched digital records vanish before, quietly. The way things vanish when nobody is looking for them anymore. Paper, at least, asked to be burned on purpose. The emergency witness protocol unlocked doors most counselors didn't know existed at all. One of them led to a records vault filed under a code so old the terminal's search function stumbled twice trying to parse it. 7 Omega. The file was there. It had always been there. 400 years of nobody looking. Charter 7 Omega, filed 4 centuries ago. Approved 4 centuries ago. Never withdrawn, never revisited, simply misplaced, the way a word gets misfiled in a drawer nobody opens. 47 signatures ran along the bottom of the scanned parchment, small and precise, ink gone the color of old tea. At the top, in language older than half the species currently arguing in the council chamber, a claim sat waiting to be read. The rimward frontier belonged to no one but the species that had signed for it, and would remain so until that species said otherwise. Nobody had ever said otherwise. Nobody had ever come back to check. Valdris sat very still. Then she reached for the cup of tea she'd left cooling hours ago and drank half of it without tasting a drop because her hands needed something to do that wasn't shaking. Charter 7 Omega was never denied, she thought. It was never enforced. The council lost the paperwork for 400 years, and nobody noticed it was missing, because nobody remembered it had ever been there to lose. She sat with that for a long time. Then she opened a second file, one she hadn't touched in decades, an old survey log from the earliest years of rimward observation. A single line she had flagged once, long ago and never closed. Hull classification, Dreadnought class. Unconfirmed. Recommend follow-up. No follow-up had ever come. She had assumed at the time that it meant nothing. She was less certain of that now than she had been in 400 years. She filed the charter discovery under Emergency Witness Protocol, sealed, time-stamped, sent to exactly one recipient, herself. There was nowhere else for it to go yet. If the Draken fleet massing at the edge of the frontier crossed the boundary before the council so much as glanced at this document, 47 signatures on a piece of parchment weren't going to stop a single ship from firing. She looked at the photograph on her datapad one more time, the human woman, the folded document, the quiet colony world behind her. We'll be here if you need us. I need you now, Valdris said to no one in the empty room and did not expect an answer. Sector 61 smelled of hot metal and the ozone tang of a reactor running 4 systems past what anyone would call comfortable. On the bridge of the Dominion's will, High Admiral Vexkel stood at the forward display, with his hands clasped behind his back, 7.5 feet of dark iron-scaled height. The bioluminescent ridges along his jaw pulsing faint blue with each slow breath. Ground troops enough to hold every world in that sector before the locals finish arguing about who ought to be in charge. He touched the old scar above his left eye, the one from Vale Core. The one he touched before every campaign. 847 ships, he said, not quite to anyone. 42 support vessels, the way another man might touch a coin for luck. This will not take long. Behind him, Commander Sarth said nothing for a moment. He was watching the navigation display instead of the Admiral, where a cluster of old readings sat quietly in the corner of the screen, flagged and dismissed by someone who wasn't him, a long time before either of them had this posting. Sarth, Vexkel's voice carried the particular patience of a man who has never once had to repeat himself twice. Report. Formation is set, Admiral. We cross into the frontier at your order. Sarth hesitated just long enough to notice himself doing it. There is a sensor anomaly logged in the approach corridor, recurring. 87 instances over 3 centuries. Vexkel didn't turn around. Sensor drift. That was the previous determination, sir. Sarth looked at the reading again. It wasn't wrong, exactly, to call it drift. It just didn't sit the way drift usually sat, too regular, too patient, like something that wanted to be found eventually and not before. Then it remains the determination. Vexkel finally turned, and the ridge along his jaw brightened half a shade. The Draken equivalent of a smile that didn't reach anywhere near warm. Commander, I have taken 14 systems. Not one of them ever had the decency to warn me first. No, Admiral. They fought. They lost. They learned what strength looks like when it is finally standing in front of them. He looked back at the display, at the long, quiet dark of the frontier waiting on the other side of the boundary line. This sector will learn the same lesson. It will simply learn it faster, because there is less of it to teach. Sarth closed the anomaly panel without another word, filed it in the back of his mind instead, and gave the order to hold formation. 2 decks down, in the crew mess, a young gunnery officer named Torv sat with a plate he hadn't touched, listening to 2 others argue about whether the Rim campaign would even count as a real fight. 847 ships against what, exactly? One of them was saying, a handful of colony militias with mining lasers? That's the intelligence we have, the other said. That's the intelligence somebody wrote down 400 years ago, and nobody's checked since, Torv said, and neither of the others answered him because neither of them had a better argument, only more confidence. On the haven, tucked into the dark behind the edge of the frontier, where no council survey had ever quite managed to look, Admiral Reyes set down her coffee without drinking it. They're in, she said. Lieutenant Harachen didn't look up from the tactical display, where 847 red points had just crossed a line. Only the haven's sensors were built to see it all. Confirmed, full Draken formation. Heading straight for the boundary, no deviation, no scouts sent ahead. They're not expecting anyone home. Reyes said it flat, the way she said most things after 22 years stationed at the edge of nowhere. They're not expecting anyone anywhere, Chen said. That's the whole file on them. 14 systems, and every one of them thought they were the last line. Reyes looked at the photograph on her desk. Earth's mountains, green and impossible. A place she hadn't set foot in for longer than she liked to add up. She'd spent 2 decades of her life making sure this exact moment, when it finally came, would not require her to leave that photograph behind for nothing. She didn't hesitate long. Wake the dreadnought, she said. Send the signal to Earth. Tell them it's time. Chen's hands moved fast across the console. Code and clearance layered 8 deep, the kind of authorization that only existed because somebody 4 centuries ago had decided the Rim was worth protecting quietly instead of loudly. Somewhere out past the haven, in a fold of space no council chart had ever correctly mapped, something old and enormous began, very slowly, to open its eyes. Signal sent, Chen said. It can hold for 11 more minutes. Neither of them said what they were both thinking. That 11 minutes was a very long time to sit still with 847 ships closing the distance. Response in 11 minutes. If the relay holds, it'll hold. Reyes picked the coffee back up, looked at it, set it back down again. It's held for 22 years. And that everything the next 400 years of the galaxy would look like was about to depend on whether something built in secret 3 centuries ago still worked exactly the way it had been promised to. Chen broke the silence first. Ma'am. If this doesn't wake up, it will, Reyes said, and this time there was nothing flat in it at all. 11 minutes came and went. Captain Elias Thorne had been waiting on the Harbinger's bridge for 11 minutes and 30 seconds before the confirmation light on the Haven's relay finally turned green, and he'd spent every one of those minutes standing rather than sitting. On the 13th, deep inside the fold no chart had ever mapped, a single confirmation light turned from red to a slow, patient green and stayed there, because some habits from 34 years of service didn't care what the moment called for. Confirmation received, said the officer at communications. Full wake sequence authorized. Then wake her, Thorne said. The Harbinger had slept inside a distortion fold for longer than most of her current crew had been alive, 14 kilometers of dark hull built in pieces over 3 centuries by shipyards that had never once appeared on a council survey. Thorne felt the deck hum under his boots as the reactor cores came up one by one, a sound like something enormous clearing its throat after a very long silence. Lieutenant Chen is sending tactical, said the comms officer. Draken fleet, 847 ships, closing on the frontier boundary, estimated crossing in under an hour. Thorne had been in the fleet for 34 years. He had spent 22 of them on the Rimwatch protocol, waiting for a day he'd half believed might never come, the way soldiers learn to half believe in wars that keep not starting. He looked at the tactical display now and felt something settle in his chest that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite dread, closer maybe to the particular calm of finally putting down something heavy he'd been carrying a long time. Broadcast the warning, he said. All frequencies, every language we've got on file for them. Give it a countdown, 3,000 seconds. Let them do the math themselves. "Hey, Captain." The message went out across 43 systems at once, translated into a dozen dialects the Draken hadn't known any outsider possessed. "You have entered a protected zone. Turn back. This is your only warning." Countdown. 3,000 seconds. On the Dominion's will, the warning hit every station on the bridge simultaneously, and for a moment nobody spoke. Vexkel read it twice before he reacted at all. "Who is transmitting this? Unknown origin," Sarth said. "The signal isn't routed through any relay we've mapped in this sector." He paused, and this time he didn't try to hide the pause. "Admiral, this is the same signature as the 87th anomaly, the mass Shadon readings. They weren't sensor drift. A bluff left behind by whatever colonial militia still squats out here. 847 ships have never required a bluff to stand aside for us before, Admiral. They have never met us before." Vexkel turned from the display. There was something waiting. Vexkel's jaw ridges flared a brighter blue, the closest thing his people had to anger showing plainly on the skin. A recording, and the old scar over his eye seemed to catch the light differently than it had an hour ago. 14 systems, Sarth. 14. Every one of them thought their gods or their ghosts or their ancestors' machines would rise up and save them at the last hour. None of them ever did. Hold formation. We cross on schedule, Sarth didn't argue. But he kept the countdown open on a side panel where the Admiral wouldn't see him watching it, and he found himself doing something he hadn't done in years of service under this man, hoping his commander was right and suspecting in a place he didn't examine too closely. He'd learned a long time ago that arguing with Vexkel mid-campaign accomplished nothing but a longer memory of who'd been wrong to try, that he wasn't. In the Spire, Councillor Talak was 3 sentences into an unrelated agriculture subsidy debate when an aide leaned in and put a data slate in front of him without asking permission. 2 decks below, Gunnery Officer Torv watched the same countdown on his own station and said nothing at all to anyone, because there was nothing left to argue that hadn't already been said in the mess hall, and because some fears are better kept quiet until they're proven, which was itself the first sign that something had gone wrong somewhere in the galaxy's usual order of business. He read it. Then he read it again. An unregistered military signal, he said slowly, originating from rimward space. "Broadcasting in 43 languages simultaneously," he looked up. "Whose 43 languages?" "Human," the aide said. "All of them, sir." Every dialect on file. The chamber, mid-argument about subsidy percentages that no longer mattered to anyone, went quiet in stages, the way a rumor spreads before the words that carry it catch up. Valdris, 3 rows down and 1 row over from where she usually sat, felt something in her chest that she recognized after 443 years as the particular ache of being right about something too late to matter. She did not stand. She did not say "I told you so," though the temptation sat behind her teeth like a held breath. She simply opened her datapad, queued the sealed Charter 7 Omega file she'd filed under Emergency Witness Protocol 2 days earlier, and waited to see whether anyone in this chamber would finally ask the right question before the wrong one got them all killed. Lack found her eyes across the chamber. 1,800 years of never having to be wrong sat differently on his face now than it had in the vote 2 days ago. Elder Valdris, his voice had lost its patience, though not yet its authority. "You invoked the Emergency Witness Protocol on this exact region 72 hours ago. I would like to know what you found." He had never once in 400 years asked me that question first. He asked it now because the ships were already moving, and asking first had stopped being a choice he could afford to skip. "I found a filed and approved charter," Valdris said, "dated 400 years ago, granting the rimward frontier to the species that signed it. I found that this council never enforced it, never revisited it, and never noticed it had been misplaced." She let that sit a moment before she added the part that would matter more in an hour than it did right now. "I also found a survey flag from that same period. Unconfirmed hull classification, Dreadnought class. Nobody in the chamber laughed at her this time. The countdown reached 2,400 seconds, then 2,000. He thought of 22 years on Rimwatch, of drills run in silence, so no council survey would ever catch a reading, of a father's mechanical wristwatch, not his own. That story belonged to another commander, a name he'd only ever seen on old fleet rosters. On the Harbinger's Bridge, Thorn watched the Draken formation hold its heading, unbroken, unhesitating, exactly the posture of a fleet that had never once been told no and believed it. Admiral Kalen Rourke, 3 postings up the chain and currently somewhere behind the haven coordinating the response that would decide whether the next 400 years looked anything like the last 400. Unfold the escorts. 42 escort craft, 6 kilometers each, slid free of hidden bays along the Harbinger's flanks and spread into formation, a ring of dark metal blooming outward with no wasted motion, no fanfare. 1,200 seconds, Chen's voice came over the relay from the haven. "They're not slowing. They don't know what slowing looks like," Thorne said. "We're about to teach them," he gave the order. The mechanical patience of something that had rehearsed this exact moment for 300 years and never once been watched doing it. Behind them, across a stretch of space the Council had surveyed a dozen times and never once seen clearly, 87 sensor nodes woke together and began to glow, faint red points scattered like something a hunter lays before the hunt begins rather than after. On the Dominion's will, the tactical display filled with new contacts faster than any operator could call them out individually. Sarth's hands went still on the console. "Admiral," he said, "you should look at this." Vexkel turned. For the first time since the campaign had begun, he didn't say anything at all. "Admiral," Sarth's voice had lost its careful neutrality entirely now. "You should look at this." Vexkel looked. The tactical display had filled with contacts in every direction his eyes could reach. Escort craft in a ring around one enormous dark hull, sensor nodes glowing like something patient finally allowed to be seen. 847 Draken ships sat inside a formation that had not fired a single shot and did not need to. "Recalculate," Vexkel said, and his voice had gone very quiet, which every officer on that bridge knew was worse than shouting. "Tell me this is a projection. A decoy field." "It isn't a projection, Admiral." Sarth's hands stayed still on the console, which took more effort than anyone watching him would guess. "The mass readings are solid. Every one of those escort hulls is real. The center contact alone reads at 14 kilometers. Somewhere behind Vexkel, a junior officer made a small involuntary sound and then went silent, ashamed of it. Nobody blamed him. They built this, Vexkel said, without a single council survey catching it. 3 centuries, and not one word. They didn't need the council to catch it, Admiral. Sarth kept his eyes on the display rather than his commander's face. They only needed us not to. The bioluminescent ridges along Vexig's jaw had gone from bright blue to something darker, dimmer, closer to the color of a man recalculating everything he'd built his 14 conquered systems on. He touched the scar above his eye without seeming to notice he'd done it. "Signal them. Demand identification." "Who commands this fleet?" "Sending now, Admiral." The reply came back faster than anyone expected, translated instantly into Draken by a system that had clearly been waiting to use it. A single voice, calm, unhurried, entirely unbothered by 847 warships sitting inside its formation. "This is Captain Elias Thorne, commanding vessel Harbinger. You have entered a protected zone." Countdown continues. "A captain," Vexkel said, "not an admiral. Not a fleet commander." Something in his posture straightened, the old certainty trying to reassert itself. "A single captain speaks for all of this. He didn't ask us to negotiate, Admiral," Sarth said. "He told us a number, and he's letting it count down." On the Harbinger's bridge, Thorne watched the same exchange from the other side and felt none of the satisfaction he might have expected after 22 years of waiting for this exact moment. Mostly he felt tired, in the specific way of a man who has spent decades preparing for something, and finally has to find out whether the preparation was any good. "They're not backing off," Chen reported. "Formation's holding." Sitting means nobody's firing. He reached for the mug of black coffee an ensign had set at his elbow 20 minutes earlier and drank it without noticing it had gone cold, the way he did most mornings on this ship. 847 ships just sitting there. "Let them sit," Thorne said. Sitting is fine. The way he'd done most mornings for 22 years of drills that never once had an audience. It was such an ordinary motion that nobody on the bridge thought twice about it. He set the mug down. He looked at the countdown. 1,200 seconds left. "Captain," Chen's voice had changed, just slightly. "Incoming transmission, not from the Draken fleet. From the Council Priority Channel?" Thorne's eyebrows lifted a fraction. In 22 years, the Council had sent this sector exactly nothing. "Put it through." Elder Valdris's voice came across the relay, small and steady, carrying 443 years of patience into a single sentence. "Captain Thorne, I am transmitting the Oath Charter. filed by your people 4 centuries ago, as evidence to this council that your presence in this sector is lawful and was always lawful. I wanted you to know that someone here finally read it." Thorn was quiet a moment. "Elder Valdris, I've read your name in old Rimwatch briefings. Nobody told me you were still filing warnings." "I never stopped," Valdris said. It seemed a poor time to start. In the spire, the chamber had gone from arguing about subsidies to something closer to a held breath. Tlack stood at the podium with the charter's scanned image projected behind him, 47 signatures visible even from the back rows. And for the first time in 1800 years, he did not appear to know what to say next. "This document," he said slowly, "predates my seat on this council by 4 centuries. It predates most of ours," said one of the 12 silver voting councillors, quietly, from the back. Valdris stood again, and this time nobody's patience for her had run thin. The charter was never denied. It was filed correctly, approved correctly, and then it sat in a records category this council stopped checking sometime after the officials who created that category retired. Nobody stole it from us. We simply stopped looking. Tlack's hand, resting on the podium, had gone very still. 1800 years of being the man who had read everything, who had never once needed to be corrected in open session, and the correction had finally arrived, 4 centuries too late to matter to anyone but him. "Then the region was never unregistered," he said. On the Dominion's will, Vexkel stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the ring of escort craft hold their formation without a single weapon discharge, and felt something he had never once felt in 14 conquered systems, the specific— "No," Valdris said. It was only unread. The countdown reached 600 seconds, cold understanding that he did not know what winning would even look like here, because nothing about this situation resembled a fight. "Admiral," Sarth said. "Orders." Vexkel didn't answer right away. Somewhere in the back of his mind, an old lesson from his own campaign doctrine surfaced, one he'd never had cause to apply before. An enemy who does not need to fight you has already decided the fight isn't necessary. He had spent his entire career believing that meant weakness. Standing here now, watching 87 sensor nodes glow steady and patient across a formation that outnumbered his own without firing a shot, he was no longer certain that belief had ever been true. "Hold position," he said finally. "Do not fire. Do not retreat. I want to see what they do with the 400 seconds they have left." Sarth relayed the order and then, very quietly, allowed himself something close to relief. It didn't last. 400 seconds. 300. The bridge of the Dominion's will had gone silent in a way it never had during 14 conquests. Every officer watching the same countdown, every one of them recalculating, in their own way, what strength was supposed to mean. At 200 seconds, a new contact bloomed on the tactical display. Not a weapon, not a ship. A single transmission, broad spectrum, broadcast to every vessel in both fleets at once, Draken and human alike, in a voice that hadn't spoken in this exchange before. It was Admiral Kalen Rourke. "High Admiral Vexkel," the voice said unhurried, carrying the particular calm of a man who had been preparing to say exactly this for 22 years. "You have not been ambushed. You have not been deceived. You crossed into space my people claimed 4 centuries ago and have held quietly, every day since, without ever asking your council or mine for permission to keep holding it. The countdown you are watching is not a threat." Vexkel stood with his hands still clasped behind his back, watching the countdown fall past 100, and felt the last of his certainty go quiet the way a reactor goes quiet when the fuel finally runs out, not violently. "It is the only warning we intend to give you." On the bridge of the Harbinger, Thorn closed his eyes for one long breath and did not open them again until the transmission ended. The transmission ended, and for 11 seconds nobody on the Dominion's will said anything at all. Just an absence where something had been running his whole life. "Admiral," Sarth said. 50 seconds. "I heard him," Vexkel said. He thought of Vale Core, the scar over his eye, 14 systems that had all in their turn learned what strength looked like standing in front of them. He had believed his entire career that this was the only lesson worth teaching. Standing here now, surrounded by a formation that had never once raised a weapon, he understood, with the particular clarity that only arrives too late to be useful, that he was looking at a different lesson entirely, and that no one had ever taught him how to read it. "They never fired," he said. "Half to Sarth, half to no one. 847 ships crossed their boundary, and they never fired a single shot. No, Admiral, they didn't need to." Vexkel touched the scar above his eye one last time, and this time his hand came away and did not go back. "We came here to take something. They only had to still be holding it. 10 seconds. 5. Signal the fleet, Vexkel said. Full retreat. All vessels immediate withdrawal from the frontier boundary, he said it quietly. The way he'd said everything since the transmission ended, and nobody on that bridge had ever heard him give an order in that particular voice before. Sarth, log it as my decision. Not a retreat under fire. A retreat from something we had no doctrine to answer. Sarth logged it exactly as ordered, and did not trust himself to say anything more than the acknowledgement the order required. The countdown reached 0. Nothing fired. Nothing needed to. 847 Draken ships began, one formation at a time, to turn away from the frontier boundary and fall back the way they had come, and the Harbinger's 42 escorts held their ring without moving to pursue because pursuit had never once been the plan. On the Harbinger's bridge, Thorn watched the Draken formation break and reform into retreat, and let out a breath he felt he'd been holding for 22 years. They're pulling out, Shen said. All contacts reversing course. No weapons discharged on either side. Send confirmation to the Haven, Thorn said. And to Earth. He paused, looking at the empty mug still sitting where he'd left it, cold and forgotten. An hour of waiting folded into one ordinary object nobody would ever think to write down in an after-action report. Tell them it held. Tell them all of it held. In the spire, the chamber received word of the retreat in the middle of Valdris's testimony, an aide sliding a data slate in front of T-Lac without asking, the same way the first warning had arrived hours before. This time T-Lac read it once and set it down without needing to read it twice. The Draken fleet has withdrawn, he said, to the full chamber, in a voice that had lost every trace of the certainty it carried into this room 1800 years ago, without engagement. The 17 Rimward Worlds representatives, watching from a gallery that had never once been full before today, said nothing, because there was nothing left that needed saying out loud. She reached into her datapad and pulled up the archive terminal's old, unused authorization code, the one attached to Charter 7 Omega, filed and forgotten for 400 years, and activated it in front of the full council, the way it had always been meant to be activated. Valdris stood at the podium where she had stood so many times before to be dismissed, and this time no one dismissed her. In the open, where everyone could finally see it. The Oath Charter illuminated on the chamber's main display. 47 signatures, ink gone the color of old tea, every one of them still legally valid, every one of them still waiting for someone to notice they had never expired. A recorded message played beneath the signatures, a human voice Valdris recognized from a photograph she had carried for 4 centuries, the same woman, younger, standing before the same quiet colony world. We didn't take the rim, the recording said. We held it for 400 years, and we never asked for permission. T-Lac listened to it in silence. 1800 years of never being wrong sitting differently on him now than it had that morning, and did not try to explain it away. Valdris left the chamber alone this time, no aide catching up to her at the second junction, and walked back to the quarters where she kept her paper files. Instead of trusting the terminal, everyone else trusted completely. She set the datapad down on the shelf beside the cooling tea she'd never finished. And beside it, for the first time in 4 centuries, she set the photograph down flat instead of holding it. The human woman in the image looked back at her. Gray-streaked hair, a folded document, a colony world gone quiet with dusk. Outside her window, the blue haze of the spire caught the last of the day's light the way it always had, 9,000 years of the same slow color, and somewhere past the edge of every chart the council had ever drawn. Valdris had touched that photograph every time the council dismissed her, for 443 years, a small private habit nobody had ever asked her about. She didn't need to touch it now. A dreadnought that had waited 3 centuries to be seen folded its escorts back into formation and turned quietly toward home.